In the heart of a city's forgotten district, a courtroom became a theatre for injustice. On the bench sat a judge whose gavel fell like a hammer of prejudice. The defendants, two decorated police officers, celebrated as heroes. The defendant, a lone black man, framed, voiceless, and condemned before he even spoke a word. The judge smirked, the cops stood tall, and the system prepared to swallow another innocent soul. They thought they were in control. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea that their victim wasn't a victim at all, but the hunter who had led them straight into his trap. The rain fell on the city of Oakhaven like a shroud, turning asphalt to black glass and washing grime into the gutters. It was the kind of night that swallowed secrets, a perfect backdrop for the kind of policing that thrived in the shadows. Inside a dented, unmarked sedan parked in a desolate alley, Officer Frank Miller took a long drag from his cigarette, the cherry glowing like a malevolent eye in the darkness. "Look at this place," he grumbled, exhaling a cloud of smoke that fogged the windshield. "Smells like wet garbage and lost hope. Perfect spot for a rat to pop his head out." His younger partner, Officer Kevin Russo, shifted nervously in the passenger seat. He was newer to this game, his conscience not yet as calloused as Miller's. "You sure about this, Frank? The tip was anonymous. Could be a prank." Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Kid, in this part of town, an anonymous tip is as good as a signed confession. They rat on each other for a pack of smokes. The CI said a dealer named Jones makes his drop here. Tonight we make our quota. Simple as that." It wasn't simple, and Russo knew it. Making quota with Miller always meant bending the rules until they snapped. It meant turning traffic stops into fishing expeditions and anonymous tips into justifications for whatever they wanted to do. Their wait wasn't long. A man turned into the alley, his silhouette framed for a moment by the distant glow of a street lamp. He was tall, dressed in a simple dark jacket and jeans, and walked with a steady, unhurried pace. He carried no bag, made no suspicious moves. He was just a man walking through an alley. For Frank Miller, that was enough. "Showtime," Miller hissed, killing the engine and throwing the car door open in one fluid, aggressive motion. Russo followed a half-second behind. "Police! Hands where I can see 'em!" Miller barked, his voice echoing off the wet brick walls. His hand was already on the butt of his gun. The man, whose name was supposedly David Jones, stopped. He didn't startle or run. He slowly raised his hands, his face calm and unreadable in the gloom. This lack of fear seemed to enrage Miller more than any resistance would have. "What's your business here, pal?" Miller said, circling him like a predator. "Just cutting through. It's the shortest way to my apartment," the man replied, his voice even and deep. "Your apartment, huh?" Miller sneered. "Let's see some ID." As the man reached slowly for his back pocket, Miller shoved him hard against the wall. "I didn't say move that fast." The man's head hit the brick with a dull thud. Russo flinched. "Take it easy, Frank," Russo murmured. Miller ignored him. He roughly patted the man down, finding only a worn leather wallet and a set of keys. He opened the wallet. "David Jones. Well, well. Looks like our tip was good after all." He pocketed the wallet. "I haven't done anything," Jones said, his voice still unnervingly calm, though a trickle of blood was now running from his temple. "You're breathing our air. That's what you've done," Miller shot back. He glanced at Russo and gave a subtle nod. It was the signal. Russo's stomach clenched, but he knew what was expected. While Miller kept Jones pinned, Russo reached into a small evidence bag he carried in his own pocket, a bag containing a small, neatly folded packet of cocaine from a previous bust that had never made it to the evidence locker. It was a practiced move. Russo found the packet in the man's jacket pocket. "Frank, look what we have here," he said, his voice betraying a slight tremor he hoped Miller wouldn't notice. Miller's grin was predatory. He held up the packet in front of Jones's face. "Cutting through the alley, huh? Looks like you were cutting something else. You're under arrest, Mr. Jones. Anything you say can and will be used to turn your life into a living hell." They twisted his arms behind his back, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. As they shoved him toward their car, Jones didn't struggle. He didn't protest or plead. He simply turned his head slightly, his dark, intelligent eyes sweeping over the alley, memorizing every detail. The overflowing dumpster, the flickering security camera on the adjacent building that he knew was fake, the exact spot where Russo had discovered the drugs. He was a man who paid attention to details. As they forced him into the back of the sedan, Frank Miller and Kevin Russo believed they had just caught another anonymous rat. They had no idea they had just arrested Director Adrian Cross, the chief of the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, and he had just gathered all the bait he needed. The trap was set. Now, it was time to see how deep the rot in Oak Haven's justice system went. The 12th Precinct's holding cell smelled of stale sweat, disinfectant, and desperation. Adrian Cross, now officially David Jones, sat on a cold metal bench, observing. The concrete walls were a canvas of faded graffiti and despairing scratches. He had been in places far worse than this, but none that represented such a casual perversion of the very laws he had sworn to uphold. He listened to the symphony of the precinct, the rhythmic click of a keyboard, the bored monotone of a desk sergeant on the phone, the angry, muffled shouting from an interrogation room down the hall. This was the engine room of the justice system, and it was running on cynicism and indifference. After a few hours, the cell door clanged open. A young woman with tired eyes and a stack of files clutched to her chest stood there. "David Jones?" she asked, her voice weary. "I'm Lena Petrova. The court appointed me as your public defender." Adrian stood up slowly. He studied her. She couldn't be more than 30, dressed in a practical but rumpled suit. There was a spark of idealism in her eyes, but it was being steadily extinguished by the sheer, crushing weight of her caseload. They sat in a small, airless interview room. The table between them was bolted to the floor. "I've read the preliminary report," Lena began, opening a file. "Officers Miller and Russo. Possession with intent to distribute. They say you were making a drop in the West End alley." She looked up at him, her expression a practiced blend of neutrality and skepticism. "You have a prior?" "No," Adrian said simply. "My record is clean." "That's good. That helps." She scribbled a note. "The report says you were cooperative. That also helps. Now tell me your side of the story. Everything you can remember." Adrian recounted the events in the alley with precise, dispassionate detail. He described Miller's aggression, Russo's hesitation, the shove against the wall, and the exact moment Russo reached into his own pocket before, finding the drugs on him. Lena listened intently, her pen hovering over the page. When he finished, she let out a long, slow sigh. "They planted it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Adrian confirmed. She closed her eyes for a moment, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. "Miller and Russo," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Of course it's them. They're precinct heroes. 2 commendations for valor in the last year. Miller is the union rep. They're practically untouchable." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Mr. Jones, I need you to be honest with me. This is your life we're talking about. Is there anything in your past that the prosecutor, Gerald Klein, can use against you? Anything at all?" "Nothing," Adrian said. "I own a small bookstore. I live alone. I pay my taxes." He had constructed his undercover identity with meticulous care. David Jones was a ghost, a perfectly average, law-abiding citizen. Lena looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. There was something different about him. He wasn't scared or angry like most of her clients. He was composed, watchful. His intelligence was palpable. "You're not like the others," she observed. "Does that matter?" "It should," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But in this case, it might not. The prosecutor will offer you a deal. Plead guilty to simple possession. They'll drop the intent to distribute. You'll do maybe a year, with parole in 6 months. If you fight this and lose, you're looking at a mandatory minimum of 10 years. Miller and Russo's testimony against a drug dealer from the West End. A jury will convict you in an hour." "I won't be taking a deal," Adrian stated calmly. Lena stared at him. "You want to go to trial? Against them? You understand what I'm saying? It's your word against 2 decorated cops." "I understand perfectly," he said. A look of pained resignation settled on her face. "Okay," she sighed. "Okay, we go to trial. But I need to warn you, our case is assigned to Judge Ryan Porter." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Adrian had studied Porter's file extensively. A former prosecutor known for his tough-on-crime stance, his rulings were legendary for their severity, especially in cases involving minority defendants. His conviction rate was staggeringly high, aided by his tendency to give prosecutors every advantage while shutting down the defense. "He despises public defenders," Lena continued, her voice flat. "He thinks we're all bleeding hearts, trying to get criminals back on the street. In his courtroom, the police are infallible saints, and defendants are guilty until proven innocent. And even then, he's not so sure. Going to trial in front of Porter with this case, it's a suicide mission." "Nevertheless," Adrian said, his gaze unwavering, "that is the mission." Lena Petrova felt a strange mix of dread and reluctant admiration. This man, David Jones, was either a fool or he possessed a kind of courage she hadn't seen in a long time. She gathered her files, her mind already racing, trying to find a crack, any crack, in the fortress she was about to assault. "All right, Mr. Jones," she said, rising to her feet. "I'll file the motion to suppress the evidence. It won't work. Porter will deny it, but we'll do it anyway. I'll see what I can dig up on Miller and Russo." She paused at the door. "Get some rest if you can. You're going to need it." As the door clanged shut, Adrian remained seated. He wasn't worried about rest. He was thinking about Judge Porter. The investigation had started with the cops, but he had a feeling it was about to lead much, much higher. The system wasn't just weighted, it was anchored to a foundation of corruption, and he was about to see just how heavy that anchor was. Judge Ryan Porter's courtroom was his kingdom. Carved from dark, imposing mahogany and presided over by a looming state seal, the room was designed to inspire awe and intimidation. From his elevated bench, Porter looked less like a dispenser of justice and more like a monarch surveying his dominion. He was a man in his late 60s with a mane of silver hair and a perpetual scowl etched onto his face. A man who believed the law was a hammer and everyone looked like a nail. Adrian Cross, seated at the defense table next to Lena Petrova, took it all in. The worn benches, the bored-looking bailiff, the ambitious glint in prosecutor Gerald Klein's eyes. He had been in federal courts, grand jury rooms, and secure facilities, but this felt different. This was where the gears of the system ground ordinary people into dust. "All rise," the bailiff droned, and Judge Porter swept into the room, his black robes billowing. He sat and immediately fixed his cold blue eyes on the defense table. "Mr. Jones," he began, skipping any pretense of judicial impartiality, "I have reviewed the file. A serious charge. Mr. Klein, is the prosecution ready to proceed with its opening statement?" "We are, Your Honor," Klein said, striding confidently to the center of the courtroom. He was smooth, polished, and knew his audience of one. Klein painted a vivid picture for the jury, a narrative of two heroic officers, Miller and Russo, patrolling the city's most dangerous streets to keep the good citizens of Oak Haven safe. He described the notorious West End Alley as a hub of criminal activity and portrayed David Jones as a predator poisoning their community. "This is a simple case," he concluded, "a case of dedicated police work stopping a drug dealer in his tracks." When it was Lena's turn, she was a study in contrast. She spoke of reasonable doubt, of the presumption of innocence, and of the danger of taking any testimony, even from police officers, at face value without scrutiny. "This is not a simple case," she argued, her voice filled with a passion that seemed to irritate the judge. "This is a case about a man's life, and it rests entirely on the word of two officers. We believe the evidence will show that their word is not enough." Porter watched her with undisguised contempt, tapping his pen impatiently on his desk. The prosecution's first witness was Officer Frank Miller. On the stand, he was the image of a seasoned, confident cop. He recounted the anonymous tip, the suspicious behavior of the defendant, and the discovery of the narcotics. His testimony was a masterclass in perjury, filled with police jargon and self-aggrandizing details. "He was nervous, shifty-eyed," Miller said, looking directly at the jury. 20 years on the force, you learn to read the signs. I knew he was holding something." When it was Lena's turn to cross-examine, the atmosphere shifted. "Officer Miller," she began, "you stated you received an anonymous tip. Was this tip recorded?" "Objection, Your Honor." Klein cut in smoothly. "Relevance. Standard procedure for confidential informants is not on trial here." "Sustained," Porter snapped before Lena could even respond. "Move on, Miss Petrova." Lena regrouped. "Officer, in your report, you state that Mr. Jones was loitering, but he told you he was walking home." Did you make any attempt to verify his address? My priority was the illegal narcotics he was carrying, Miller said, his tone self-righteous. That's called good police work. Did you or your partner activate your body cameras during the encounter? Miller shifted slightly in his seat. There was a technical malfunction. The humidity that night. It happens. A malfunction with both of your cameras at the same time? Lena pressed. Objection. Argumentative. Klein boomed. Sustained. Porter slammed his gavel. Ms. Petrova, you are on thin ice. Do you have a relevant question, or are you just here to waste the court's time with baseless insinuations? Throughout the exchange, Adrian remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Miller. He wasn't watching him as a defendant. He was watching him as an investigator. He noted the slight twitch in Miller's eye when he lied about the cameras, the way he puffed out his chest when reciting his practiced lines. These were the tells of a man who had lied on the stand so many times he no longer saw it as a crime, but as a tool of his trade. Next came Officer Kevin Russo. His testimony mirrored Miller's, but his demeanor was different. He was less confident, his answers shorter, his eyes constantly flicking towards Miller and Judge Porter, as if for approval. Lena saw a potential crack. Officer Russo, she said gently. You were the one who found the drugs, is that correct? Yes, ma'am, he mumbled. Describe to me exactly where you found them. In his right jacket pocket. And what did you do immediately before searching his pocket? Russo hesitated. I was patting him down for weapons. Isn't it true, officer, that you first reached into your own pocket before searching Mr. Jones? Russo's face went pale. Klein was on his feet instantly. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Sustained. Ms. Petrova, that is an outrageous accusation, Porter thundered, his face turning a blotchy red. One more stunt like that and I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand me? Lena's shoulders slumped in defeat. Yes, Your Honor. She had no more questions. As she walked back to her seat, she felt the case collapsing around her. The judge was a brick wall, the prosecutor was a snake, and the cops were protected by a shield of blue. She glanced at her client, expecting to see despair. Instead, Adrian Cross gave her a look of calm reassurance, accompanied by a barely perceptible nod. It was a strange, disarming gesture. It was the look of a commander telling his soldier to hold the line, that reinforcements were on the way. For a fleeting moment, Lena Petrova felt a flicker of hope, though she had absolutely no idea why. The trial dragged into its second day, and the walls of Judge Porter's kingdom seemed to grow taller and more impenetrable. Every attempt Lena Petrova made to introduce doubt was met with a judicial sledgehammer. Her strategy was to expose the pattern of behavior, to show the jury that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a well-established routine for Officers Miller and Russo. The system, however, was designed to prevent exactly that. Lena's first move was to submit a formal discovery request for the personnel files of both officers, specifically any and all civilian complaints filed against them. In his chambers, before the jury was brought in, Porter held the motion in his hand as if it were a piece of filth. Miss Petrova, what is the meaning of this fishing expedition? He demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. Prosecutor Klein stood beside the judge's desk, looking smug. Your Honor, Lena argued, keeping her voice steady. We have reason to believe Officer Miller, in particular, has a history of similar arrests in the same area. Arrests that have resulted in dropped charges or dismissals. This speaks to a pattern of planting evidence to meet quotas or clear cases. The jury has a right to know if the star witness has a history of perjury. Porter tossed the motion onto his desk. "Denied," he said flatly. "You are not putting the Oak Haven Police Department on trial. Civilian complaints are not convictions. They are the grumblings of criminals who got caught. This is a desperate, baseless attempt to smear the names of two decorated officers. It is inadmissible character evidence, and I will not allow it in my courtroom." "But, Your Honor, the precedent set in." "I am aware of the precedent, Ms. Petrova," Porter interrupted, his voice rising. "And in this courtroom, I am the precedent. The ruling is final." Back in the courtroom, Lena felt a cold knot of despair tighten in her stomach. Her best weapon had been taken from her before she could even draw it. She had to rely on cross-examination. But with Porter sustaining every objection Klein made, it was like trying to punch through concrete. She tried a different angle. She called a character witness for David Jones, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who owned the bakery next to his bookstore. She testified that he was a kind, quiet man who often gave free books to neighborhood children. On cross-examination, Klein was merciless. "Mrs. Gable, you're not with Mr. Jones 24 hours a day, are you?" "Well, no. So you have no idea what he does at night, in dark alleys, do you?" "He's a good man," she insisted. "Objection," Lena said weakly. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Overruled," Porter said with a bored wave of his hand. "Reasonable questions." Through it all, Adrian watched. He was a statue of calm at the defense table. His stillness was unnerving. It wasn't the resignation of a defeated man, but the focused patience of a master strategist watching his opponent's moves, letting them overextend, letting them reveal their arrogance and their weaknesses. During a brief recess, Lena turned to him, her face etched with frustration. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He's blocked everything. I can't get anything through. It's like the entire system is rigged." "You're doing an excellent job, Miss Petrova," Adrian said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of anxiety. "You are showing the appellate court, and anyone else who might be watching, exactly what you said, that the system is rigged." The phrase, "anyone else who might be watching," struck her as odd, but she was too consumed by the failing case to give it much thought. "An appeal is years away," she said, "after you've already been in prison." Adrian's eyes met hers. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to let the sickness progress to fully expose the disease. Just keep fighting." His words, meant to be encouraging, sent a chill down her spine. It sounded less like a legal strategy and more like a battle plan. The final piece of the prosecution's case was a forensic expert from the police department's own crime lab. He testified that the fingerprints on the drug packet were smudged and unidentifiable, except for one partial print that could be consistent with the defendant's. "Could be consistent?" Lena pressed on cross-examination. "That's not a positive match, is it?" "No, it's not a definitive match, but..." "So you cannot definitively say my client's fingerprint was on that packet?" "Objection," Klein shouted, asked and answered. "Sustained," Porter boomed, glaring at Lena. "The expert has given his opinion. The jury can interpret it as they see fit. But Porter's tone made it clear how he wanted them to interpret it. The prosecution rested its case. The evidence was flimsy, based entirely on the word of two cops with a history of misconduct, and supported by a lab report that was inconclusive at best. Yet, in this courtroom, under the tyrannical rule of this judge, it felt like an ironclad case. Lena looked at the jury. They were a mix of bored, confused, and intimidated faces. They looked to the judge for guidance, and he was giving it to them with every glare, every ruling, every tap of his pen. She had to put Adrian on the stand. It was their only chance. As she leaned over to tell him, he spoke first, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I won't be testifying." Lena was stunned. "But they'll see you. They'll hear your side." "They will see a man the prosecutor will paint as a liar," Adrian countered, "and Judge Porter will allow it. No, the defense rests." Lena felt the floor drop out from beneath her. "We're not putting on a defense?" "You've already presented the best defense possible, Ms. Petrova," Adrian said, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench. "You've shown that in this courtroom, for a man like me, there is no defense." The air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation as the trial moved into its final phase. The closing arguments were the last chance to sway the jury, but everyone present felt as though the story had already been written. Prosecutor Gerald Klein approached the jury box with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood. He moved with an easy confidence, born from years of practicing in a system that favored his position. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice resonating with manufactured sincerity. "The defense would have you believe in a grand conspiracy. They want you to think that two of Oak Haven's finest officers, men who have risked their lives for this city, decided one rainy night to ruin the life of a complete stranger for no reason whatsoever." He paused, letting the absurdity of the notion hang in the air. "What is more likely? That these two decorated heroes concocted an elaborate frame-up? Or that a man found in a known drug-trafficking alley with a distributable quantity of cocaine was, in fact, a drug dealer?" He walked over to the evidence table and pointed at the small plastic bag. "This poison," he said, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper, "was destined for our streets, for our children. And these officers," he turned and gestured to Miller and Russo, who sat looking stoic and honorable, "stopped it. They did their job. Don't let the defense's desperate tactics and baseless smears distract you from that simple, undeniable truth. Find the defendant guilty. Do your job." Klein returned to his seat, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had kept it simple, played on fear, and reinforced the authority of the police. In Porter's court, it was a winning formula. Then, it was Lena Petrova's turn. She rose slowly, the weight of the inevitable verdict pressing down on her. She felt exhausted, but as she looked at her client, at his inexplicably calm face, she found a final reserve of strength. She owed him a fight, even a losing one. She stood before the jury, not as a slick performer, but as an earnest advocate. "What Mr. Klein calls baseless smears, I call legitimate questions," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Questions that have been systematically silenced in this courtroom. Why was there no recorded tip? Why did two officers' body cameras mysteriously malfunction at the exact same time? Why was the only physical evidence, the fingerprint, inconclusive? She took a step closer. The prosecution talks about what is likely. Let me ask you what is likely. Is it likely that a man with no criminal record, a quiet bookstore owner, suddenly decides to become a high-level drug trafficker? Or is it more likely that two officers, under pressure to make arrests, took a shortcut? That they saw a man in the wrong neighborhood and decided he fit the part? Her voice rose with passion. The presumption of innocence is the bedrock of our justice system. It is not a technicality. It is a shield, and the prosecution has not come close to breaking that shield. They have offered you the testimony of two officers, and nothing more. Their testimony has been protected from scrutiny, their histories hidden from you. If that is enough to take a man's freedom, then the shield of innocence is worthless. She ended her plea and returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had done all she could. She had spoken the truth. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that it wouldn't matter. Judge Porter gave his instructions to the jury. His language was technically neutral, but his tone was anything but. He emphasized the weight that should be given to the testimony of law enforcement officers, and subtly dismissed the defense's arguments as speculation. The jury was out for less than 45 minutes. It was an insultingly short amount of time to decide a man's fate. When they filed back into the jury box, none of them would look at the defense table. Lena felt her stomach plummet. The foreman, a nervous-looking man in a wrinkled suit, handed the slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Porter glanced at it, and a thin, cruel smile touched his lips. On the charge of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, he read, his voice booming in the silent room. We the jury find the defendant, David Jones. He paused for dramatic effect. Guilty. A gasp came from Mrs. Gable in the gallery. Lena Petrova closed her eyes, the single word hitting her like a physical blow. Beside her, Officers Miller and Russo exchanged a subtle, triumphant smirk. They had won. The system had worked for them, just as it always did. Lena finally turned to her client, expecting to see a man broken by the injustice. But Adrian Cross did not look broken. He looked ready. His jaw was set, and his eyes were not on the jury or the judge, but on the main doors at the back of the courtroom, as if he were waiting for a curtain to rise. The verdict wasn't the end of the play. It was merely the end of Act 1. With the guilty verdict hanging in the air like poison, a suffocating finality descended upon the courtroom. The fight was over. The system had won. Now came the grim spectacle of the punishment. On his elevated bench, Judge Ryan Porter seemed to grow larger, his posture straightening as he prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow. This was the part of the proceedings he relished most, the moment his power was most tangible, most absolute. This was when he ceased to be a mere arbiter and became a god in his own small kingdom, dispensing fates as he saw fit. "Mr. Jones, please rise," he commanded, his voice resonating with a deep, theatrical authority. Adrian Cross stood, his movements fluid and unhurried. He was not stooped by the verdict, nor shackled by fear. He stood tall, his hands clasped calmly behind his back, and met the judge's gaze with an unnerving placidity. This quiet dignity, this refusal to appear broken, seemed to stoke the fires of Porter's contempt. It was a defiance he could not tolerate. He began to speak, his words not for the court record, but for the validation of his own prejudices. "I have presided over this court for 2 decades, he started, his voice a low rumble. "In that time, I have seen the rot that spreads through a city when men like you are allowed to fester. You are not a victim of circumstance, Mr. Jones. You are a catalyst of decay, a walking embodiment of the blight that good, decent people of this city fear." He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his bench. His eyes scanned the room, pausing on the smug faces of Miller and Russo, then on the crestfallen face of Lena Petrova, before finally settling back on Adrian. "You stand there, a peddler of poison, a purveyor of violence, and you erode the very fabric of our society. And you do so with a smug silence, a lack of remorse that I find utterly chilling." The tirade was escalating, becoming a sermon of self-righteous fury. Lena Petrova, who had been sitting in a state of numb despair, felt a spark of defiance ignite within her. She could not change the verdict, but she would not sit silently while this judge stripped her client of his humanity. She rose to her feet, her voice trembling but clear. "Your Honor, I object to this characterization. My client maintains his innocence, and this vitriol has no place in a sentencing hearing." Porter's head snapped towards her. A cruel, vicious smile touched his lips. He had been waiting for this. "Objection? On what grounds, Counselor? That the truth is uncomfortable?" He slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "Your client forfeited his right to a pleasant characterization the moment he chose to poison our streets. You have fought this losing battle with all the misguided idealism of a child. Now sit down and listen, or I will have the bailiff escort you to a holding cell to contemplate your contempt for this court." Humiliated and powerless, Lena sank back into her chair, the glares from Miller and Russo burning into her. The judge turned his venomous gaze back to Adrian. Throughout the entire outburst, Adrian hadn't flinched. His expression remained one of deep, analytical calm. He wasn't receiving a sentence. He was observing a specimen in its natural habitat, noting its patterns, its tells, its rabid aggression. Every word Porter spoke was not a condemnation of David Jones, but a confession from Judge Ryan Porter, a final, damning piece of evidence for the case file Adrian was building in his mind. "The law provides guidelines for this offense," Porter continued, his voice dripping with condescension as he picked up a document, only to toss it aside. "But guidelines are for men who might one day see the error of their ways, for souls who might be rehabilitated. I see no such potential here. I see only a hardened criminal who must be excised from the body of this city like the tumor he is." He stood to his full height, his black robes making him an imposing, almost demonic figure of judgment. "I must send a message to every other dealer lurking in the alleys, to every other predator who thinks this city is their hunting ground. The message is this: we will find you, we will convict you, and we will put you away for so long that you will forget what the sun feels like. It is the sentence of this court that you, David Jones, be remanded to the custody of the Oakhaven State Penitentiary for a term of no less than 20 years. He savored the words, drawing them out, letting their weight crush the hope from the room. He raised his gavel high, ready to bring it down and seal a man's fate forever. But the gavel never fell. A voice, as calm and clear as a ringing bell in a storm, cut through the judge's declaration. "Before you conclude, Judge Porter, I believe there is a matter of federal jurisdiction that must be addressed." The voice came from the defendant. Adrian Cross had not shouted. He had not pleaded. He had spoken with an effortless authority that was so out of place, so utterly unexpected, that it brought the entire courtroom to a dead halt. Porter froze, his gavel held aloft, his face a mask of disbelief turning to apoplectic rage. "You are in no position to speak, prisoner," he roared, his voice cracking. "Your time for words is over. Bailiff, restrain him." The bailiff took a hesitant step forward, but Adrian held up a single, steady hand. It was not a gesture of surrender, but of command. The sheer, unshakable confidence behind it was enough to make the bailiff stop in his tracks. "My name," the defendant said, his voice now undergoing a remarkable transformation, shedding its disguise of an ordinary citizen and taking on the sharp, resonant timbre of command, "is not David Jones." A collective gasp went through the gallery. Lena Petrova stared, her mind refusing to compute. Miller and Russo exchanged a confused, uneasy glance. Adrian reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was deliberate, broadcasting his intent. He produced a small, immaculate black leather case. With a flick of his thumb, he flipped it open. "My name is Adrian Cross. I am the director of the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility." He held the credentials aloft. Gleaming against the dark leather, the golden shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation seemed to catch every ray of light in the dim courtroom, shining like a star. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Prosecutor Klein's jaw fell open. Lena Petrova felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Officer Kevin Russo made a small, choked sound, his face turning the color of ash. Officer Frank Miller's smug confidence vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed horror. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. And Judge Ryan Porter, the monarch in his mahogany kingdom, stared at the golden badge as if it were the face of the devil himself. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, mottled grey. The absolute, unshakable power he had wielded moments before evaporated like mist in a scorching sun, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning terror. The man he had just tried to bury for 20 years was not a common criminal. He was the law, a higher, more powerful law than Porter had ever known. "This entire proceeding," Director Cross announced, his voice now ringing with the full, unchecked authority of the federal government. "From the fabricated tip to the planted evidence, from the perjured testimony to this very sentence, has been the final piece of a year-long federal investigation into corruption within the Oakhaven Police Department and judiciary." He turned his head slightly, his piercing gaze sweeping over the gallery until it landed on two unassuming men in grey suits who had been sitting quietly in the back row, watching the entire spectacle. "Agents," Director Cross commanded, his voice sharp and absolute, "secure the courtroom." The moment the words left Director Cross's mouth, the very physics of the courtroom seemed to alter. The air, once thick with the oppressive weight of injustice, became thin and sharp, crackling with an electric tension. For a long, breathless second, no one moved. The jury sat like stone figures, their minds struggling to bridge the impossible gap between the condemned man they had just convicted and the high-ranking federal officer now standing before them. Prosecutor Gerald Klein's mouth hung agape, his carefully constructed case dissolving into ash. At the clerk's desk, a pen slipped from a nerveless hand and clattered onto the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Judge Porter's face was a canvas of warring emotions. Shock was the first to arrive, followed by a surge of indignant rage. This was his kingdom, his sanctuary of absolute power. An insurrection was unthinkable. This is an outrage, a travesty, he finally managed to sputter, his voice a pale, shaky imitation of its usual authoritative boom. You have no authority here. This is a state court. As if on cue, Director Cross's command, "Agents, secure the courtroom," cut through the judge's blustering. The two men in grey suits in the gallery rose as one. Simultaneously, the grand double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, not with a crash, but with a quiet, powerful swing. A dozen more individuals, men and women in dark, professional suits, flowed into the room. They moved with a silent, coordinated grace that was more intimidating than any show of force. They were not cops. They were federal agents, and their presence instantly turned the Oakhaven courtroom into a federal crime scene. One agent approached the stunned bailiff, speaking in a low, calm voice. The bailiff, who moments ago had been ready to physically restrain David Jones, now found himself meekly surrendering his firearm. Other agents stationed themselves at every exit, their calm, watchful eyes sweeping the room, their posture signaling absolute control. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a tectonic upheaval. Adrian Cross took a deliberate step forward, away from the defense table, occupying the center of the floor. He was no longer the defendant. He was the commander of this operation, and his transformation was mesmerizing. The quiet, observant David Jones was gone. In his place stood a man of immense authority, his posture radiating confidence, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Judge Porter," Cross began again, his voice now devoid of any submissiveness, resonating with the cold, hard clarity of steel. "You are correct. This was a state court. But when a state judge conspires with police officers to deprive a United States citizen of his constitutional rights under the color of law, it becomes a federal matter. And you, Your Honor, have made it our matter on a grand scale." "Conspiracy? That's a ludicrous accusation," Porter shot back, though a tremor of fear was now detectable beneath his rage. Cross gestured to an agent who stepped forward holding a small, sleek digital recorder. "We began by investigating a string of suspicious arrests made by Officers Miller and Russo," Cross explained, his voice projecting to every corner of the now silent room. "We followed the trail of lies, of planted evidence, of perjured testimony, and that trail led us directly to this courthouse, right to your bench." He nodded to the agent, who pressed a button. The smug, confident voice of Officer Frank Miller filled the air. "Porter owes me. I made 3 of his biggest cases for him, back when he was a DA. He knows how the game is played. As long as the paperwork is clean, he doesn't ask questions. A quick conviction, another feather in his cap. It's a good system. Miller, who had been frozen in horror, seemed to snap. He lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage. "That's illegal. You can't record me without a warrant. I'll have your badge for this." "We had a warrant, Officer Miller," Cross replied, his tone icy. "A federal warrant signed by a magistrate 2 months ago, authorizing surveillance on you, your partner, and your esteemed judicial contact. We also have a warrant for your arrest." 2 agents closed in on Miller, their movements swift and decisive. Miller struggled, his facade of the heroic cop crumbling to reveal the desperate thug beneath. "Get your hands off me! I'm a cop! I'm the union rep!" he snarled, trying to wrench his arm free. "You're a disgrace to the badge you hide behind," Cross declared, his voice cutting through Miller's frantic protests like a razor. "Frank Miller, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fabrication of evidence, and multiple violations of Title 18 of the U.S. Code." The sharp, distinct click of handcuffs ratcheting shut seemed to echo the finality of the sentence Porter had been about to deliver. Next, Cross turned his piercing gaze upon Kevin Russo. The younger officer had not moved. He sat utterly broken, his body trembling, a low, guttural sob escaping his lips. He was the weak link, and he knew it. "Officer Russo," Cross said, and his tone softened, not with pity, but with the pragmatism of an investigator offering a deal. "We know Miller was the lead. We have recordings of him pressuring you, threatening your career if you didn't go along. You now have a choice to make. You can either spend the next decade of your life in a federal prison, loyal to a man who used you, or you can tell the unvarnished truth and become the government's star witness against this entire corrupt enterprise. I suggest you think very carefully about your future." It wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Russo looked up, his face a mess of tears and terror, his eyes pleading. He couldn't speak, but he gave a frantic, jerking nod, a gesture of total and complete surrender. Finally, Director Cross turned his attention back to the man on the bench. Porter had been frantically whispering to the court clerk, his mind racing for an escape, a legal loophole, an angle to fight back. But there was none. "And you, Judge Porter," Cross said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level as he took a step toward the dais. The recording was just the beginning. We have everything. Financial records showing a series of untraceable gifts from the police union that coincide perfectly with your dismissals of misconduct lawsuits against their members. We have sworn testimony from a clerk in your own chambers. And most damningly, we have the full, unedited audio and video recording of this entire trial, captured by high-resolution microphones and microcameras hidden in this courtroom. He let that sink in. Every biased ruling, every snide remark, every sustained objection designed to obstruct the truth, it's all been documented. You weren't presiding over a trial, Judge. You were starring in our final exhibit. 2 senior agents, their faces grim and professional, began to ascend the steps to the bench. Porter shrank back in his high-backed leather chair, the symbol of his authority now a cage. "You can't arrest a judge in his own courtroom," he stammered, the words hollow and pathetic. "We can," Cross stated with chilling finality, and we are. Judge Ryan Porter, you are under arrest for conspiracy against rights and obstruction of justice. As the agents reached him, one of them gently but firmly took the gavel from the desk where Porter's trembling hand rested. They stood him up, and as they placed his hands behind his back, his black judicial robe slipped from his shoulders and pooled on the floor like a deflated shroud. The click of the handcuffs was the last sound of his long, corrupt career. Through it all, Lena Petrova stood motionless, a silent witness to the impossible. Her mind was a whirlwind, replaying every moment of the past few days. Adrian's strange calm during the arrest, his refusal to take a plea deal, his cryptic words, "You have to let the sickness progress to fully expose the disease." It all clicked into place with a terrifying, brilliant clarity. He hadn't been her client. She had been his. He had hired her, in a sense, to play her part authentically, to show the world what an honest defense looked like in a kingdom of lies. As the disgraced judge and his accomplices were led away, Adrian Cross walked over to her. The fierce intensity in his eyes softened as he looked at her. "Ms. Petrova," he said, his voice now quiet and sincere, "I apologize for the deception. Your involvement was necessary to see how the system would treat a truly defenseless man under Judge Porter's rule. We needed a defense that was genuine, untainted by our operation." He paused. "You fought for me with integrity, passion, and a courage that this court does not deserve. You should be immensely proud." Lena could only stare, shaking her head in disbelief. I thought we had lost," she whispered. "You never lose," Director Cross replied, "when you're fighting on the side of the truth." The karma that had been so long overdue had finally arrived in Oakhaven. It hadn't come as a gentle correction, but as a federal tidal wave, washing away the corrupt, the prejudiced, and the powerful, and leaving in its wake the shocking, undeniable light of a new day. The reckoning was complete. The fall of Judge Porter and his corrupt allies sent shock waves through the city of Oakhaven. The federal investigation, spearheaded by Director Adrian Cross, uncovered a web of corruption that led to the indictment of over a dozen police officers and 2 other city officials. The case became a national headline, a stunning cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked and prejudice is allowed to wear a judge's robe. Lena Petrova, invigorated by the events, went on to lead a task force dedicated to judicial reform, ensuring that no one else would have to face a system so deliberately stacked against them. This story serves as a powerful reminder that justice isn't always found in the obvious places. Sometimes it works silently in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The courage of one person to go undercover, to risk everything, to expose the truth, can bring down an entire corrupt kingdom. If this story of karmic justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to see that the good guys can, and do, win. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story of